Thank you all for being here. It's would be better to be there in person, but nice to see you here online. So I'm a scholar in business and politics. This is a paper that might go back to business and society. I might try to see if I can get it past the reviewers there. It relates to CSR and democracy. And unfortunately, the situation is really quite grim regarding not just electoral democracy, but at least liberal democracy with protections for minority rights. The indicators are very bad. Even though Trump and Bolsonaro are now out of office, the overall indicators look terrible. More than half of the world population live in autocracies. Approximately half of the world's gross economic product is also in autocracies. And the scenes that we've seen in many places across the world, the United States, but even places like Germany, are really quite dramatic and unprecedented. So my paper is an examination of responsible business on one hand, and the role that they can play in taking a stand, a public stand normally, against right-wing populists. Right-wing populists, I believe, the causes are very complex. There are many multiple causes of the current crisis, but they're manifested, I think, in the form of right-wing populists, and they are indeed right-wing anti-systemic forces pose a very major threat to the survival of liberal democracy in many societies across the world. So what I'm going to talk about, the empirical part of my presentation really is to theorize the relationship between CSR and right-wing populism, and to look at the circumstances, the conditions under which responsible business organizations and companies can and are willing to actually take a stand to defend liberal democracy against populists here. So my major focus in the paper is on three large countries in which right-wing populists have recently formed the government or do still form the government. Brazil and the US, they're not in the government anymore. India, they are still in office. I'm also going to touch on some other countries, including Hungary. And there is really some variation. That's the core of the sort of paper. The core of my argument is to try to explain why business is sometimes willing to speak out and other times not. I think my general argument here is that the default strategy of responsible business is to avoid this issue as much as possible. Confronting right-wing populists is very unpleasant. It can get you into a lot of trouble. They're very loud, they shout, they will engage in various kinds of nasty online behavior, etc. Right-wing populism is too hot to handle. Most responsible business people prefer to avoid the issue, but there are some who do things and strategies. I'll just lay them out here on the slide here. You can speak out in public. You can launch campaigns in defense of democracy, not necessarily or criticizing the populists. You can support the political opponents of the populists. You can build or fund alliances against them. Also, one additional point here, under what circumstances can we expect responsible businesses to actually take a stand and defend democracy? Clearly, I think two really jump out. When there's an imminent threat of them taking power. So these tsunami moments, as my colleague Julio Carrion at Delaware has called them, are when the right-wing populists take power, or in Hobbesian moments of acute political confrontation or moments of severe crisis, where the survival of democracy itself is at stake. So these are very loud, high salience events. And when it's quiet and it's operation by stealth, as we know, democracy is probably going to die, and autocrats tend to be very successful. There's some other stuff in here that I'm not going to touch on because I just don't have enough time. The general, I think, point of this slide is to show that this is the Liberal Democracy Index. Sorry, it's not indicated here, of the VDEM Institute. The further down you go, the lower liberal democracy is. Look at, for example, Hungary and India are quite low, not as low as Turkey, but quite low. The more difficult it is for business, and the quieter business will tend to be. Okay, first of all, next, quickly, some theoretical reflections. I think that responsible business people and right-wing populists, they're all oriented, by values. They have different value orientations, but they inhabit very different bubbles, right? So CSR is very liberal, very pluralistic. It celebrates diversity, stakeholder management. Populism is illiberal. It venerates the pure people, the virtuous people, the real people. It denounces the corrupt elite. The object and scope of concern of CSR and right-wing populism is very different. So CSR tends to be global in orientation, very cosmopolitan, universal human rights, workers in global supply chains, etc. Right-wing populism tends to be nationalist, nativist, and anti-global in orientation. The global companies that practice CSR represent, I think, to a large extent, cosmopolitan business elites. Right-wing populists tend to be very strong and have a lot of support in small business. For example, Marine Le Pen, I'm sure that Rassemblement National has a very strong bloc in small business, but not in the large listed companies in France. Right-wing populists are anti-institutional in orientation, whereas the CSR types try to reform institutions, improve them, for example, with non-financial reporting. Right-wing populists engage in simple, direct communication. CSR is a world of political correctness, specialized technical jargon, technocracy, etc. So that's it for theory. Quickly on to my empirical cases, since I'm short on time here. So in Brazil, I think this is Jair Bolsonaro, who was defeated in the recent presidential election, and who did really present a very serious threat to democracy in Brazil. He venerated the military dictatorship. He was openly authoritarian. He tried to reform the electoral institutions in ways here. And what we do see, in fact, is notable engagement by the responsible business community, in particular the Instituto Ethos, the Ethos Institute, headquartered in Sao Paulo, which has been very, very active in defending Brazilian democracy against these attacks. Some examples here: the Pact for Democracy, I think, is notable here. I interviewed some people from the Ethos Institute, and they were very vocal and very outspoken. My claim here is not that they themselves deserve all the credit for defeating Bolsonaro. Absolutely not. That's not true. But they're part of that. They did play a role. And again, this quote from one of my interviewees here: "Sustainable development is only possible if we have democracy," I think indicates the kind of role that they played. Bolsonaro's presidency, again, to go back a little bit to the theoretical claims in my paper, I think really was a Hobbesian moment where democracy in Brazil was deeply threatened. And good for the opponents of Bolsonaro. It's sort of these liberal values, or these democratic values, and opposition to Bolsonaro aligned quite well. One of my interviewees here, Ricardo Young, said it's impossible to support ESG and Bolsonaro. It just doesn't work. They've supported a lot of civil society organizations, and even been more active in the political realm, apparently, than they have in the core realm of, CSR work. And just as I wrap up, Brazil now, they have actually had a fairly good, one would wonder whether some Brazilian businesses had been worried that this is too risky to speak out against Bolsonaro when he's in office. But actually, you can see here, year 2021 and 2022, when Bolsonaro actually, his final years in office, they actually had more joiners than leavers. So they've done quite well. The United States also is, I think, quite a good case. A lot of large parts, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and large parts of American business were happy with deregulation. They were also happy with Trump's tax cuts. Well, let me be totally clear about that. But there are other things that they didn't like. The half of the country that is more aligned with the Democratic tribe in the United States clearly didn't like a lot of things that Trump did, and they were in fact highly mobilized. So there were business organizations like BSR, regional organizations like VBSR, the Sustainable Business Network, companies like Patagonia that launched lawsuits against the government, whether it was environmental regulations or related basically to the electoral system itself, to democratic institutions themselves. There's been quite a lot of activity here. Before I move on, just very quickly, a regional organization here in Vermont, I think is quite interesting here. The point that I want to get across is these responsible business people or business organizations, which are my main units of analysis in the paper, were very heavily aligned with the political opposition of Trump, with the Democratic Party, right? With sort of liberal parts of the Democratic Party, and even donated extra money to help support sustainable business and to help defeat Trump. This isn't a core part of my paper, but interesting and maybe frightening things are happening in Israel right now. This might also be described as a Hobbesian moment where the survival of Israeli democracy itself is at stake. This is a very important, very pivotal time. And we can see there many people have been on the streets in recent months in Israel, but important parts of the Israeli business community have also taken a stand. Also responsible business, for example, Mala, have also been part of this attempt to defend Israeli democracy. Okay, now to the darker. I have 3 minutes left here, maybe. The less cheery part of my talk. So in other environments, for example, India, it's much more difficult. In fact, there we don't observe much business voice. So in India, I have scanned the environment to try to find similar examples of responsible business engagement for Indian democracy. I've been largely unsuccessful. There was one campaign speaking out against hate, which occurred a couple of years ago, which was a veiled critique of some members of the Hindu nationalist BJP government, not of Prime Minister Modi himself and not of all the BJP members. There was some, when they crossed some red line, being extremely hateful was something that they condemned. But that's really the exception rather than the rule. There is these Bharat Jodo Yatra, this march that occurred last year or earlier this year in India here by the opposition party, by the Congress party, did have some business people, small business people who are willing to participate. Large businesses were largely absent. So if there's a political vehicle, they're willing to do something. The story, unfortunately, sorry, this slide is partially in German, the destruction of Hungarian democracy, large multinational businesses that have been ostensibly committed to responsible business, such as the Volkswagen Group, have been largely silent, and to my knowledge have really not spoken out, certainly not in public, against anything that Orban has done to destroy democracy in Hungary. Orban, of course, is very business friendly, so that makes it more difficult for them to do so. So I'm almost out of time, I think at 14 minutes here. So I think the story in Turkey is very similar. One person from Turkey said we need to avoid any political language because we're going to get into trouble. I'm sure that's true after Erdogan has won yet again. with very bad consequences for democracy in his country. Nordic countries where the right-wing populists are in power, there hasn't been too much activity or engagement there either. I'll move to my conclusion since I'm out of time. So right-wing populists threaten not only sustainability, but also democracy itself. The default stance, I've argued, is silence, avoidance, and non-engagement. I think that is empirically true. I cannot show you systematic empirical evidence that that is the case, but I'm convinced that that is true. Right-wing populists are very difficult opponents. Critiquing them is risky and dangerous. And the voice of CSR diminishes along with right-wing populists, a dominance and hegemony. Although we do have these cases, these divided countries, the United States, Brazil, where we do have these nice moments. In Hobbesian moments, a business can play a role. And this is my final slide here, I'll stop. The motivations, I think, are not only, there can be a business case to speak out. I think it does exist, for example, in the United States, Patagonia and other companies that are in a certain bubble, the opposition bubble, can benefit themselves by benefit their business by speaking out. But I think values are a big part of this story as well. When values and interests align, obviously that's the best case scenario. And I will stop because I've spoken for too long. So sorry for going over time. I could speak longer, but I won't. So sorry.
Okay, thank you. It's time now to go to the next presentation, Wesley.
Great, thank you. Let me share my screen. I have to warn you, my computer died twice during Daniel's presentation. So unfortunately, I missed part of your presentation and I might miss part of mine, but we'll find out. So thanks for having me. The title of this paper is Beyond the Top 1%, Trends in Wealth Concentration Among the World's Billionaires. And I usually like to start this talk by pointing to some of the recent headlines about billionaires, both as a demonstration of their ubiquity in the news, as well as in other domains of social life. And so in the past few weeks, we've had some interesting stories. Silvio Berlusconi, of course, the famous Italian billionaire and former prime minister, died. We've had rumorings of a cage match between Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, which is interesting. We've had a story in ProPublica in the United States about another Supreme Court justice and his relationships with the billionaire who may have had business before the court. And then finally, we have this little op-ed from the Financial Times about climate change and other problems titled, "Billionaires Want to Save the World, so what's wrong with that?" I won't dwell on these, but the serious point that I make in this paper is that we have a large and reinvigorated literature on wealth inequality and economic elites, but we don't often talk explicitly about the unique importance or ahistorical wealth of billionaires. We talk about economic elites, we talk about the super rich, the super bourgeoisie, the top 1%, for example, but these terms might not be specific enough to address the actual levers of change in a hyper-stratified wealth distribution. And so I take this as my starting point. First, that wealth concentration is a key component of economic inequality. It tells us something about the extent of wealth inequality, but it also tells us something about status hierarchy. Two, there isn't that much data out there on top wealth holders. They're not included in many of the key studies of wealth for various reasons. There's no, or at least very little administrative data out there on them. They don't often appear in household surveys for obvious reasons. And three, these missing individuals are important both for characterizing the actual extent of wealth concentration and for other socially important reasons. Here's a quick little heuristic illustration to give you sort of a sense of the difference in wealth between those whom we're talking about when we're referring to the top 1% and billionaires. And so the graph on the left is basically showing you the median wealth holdings by percentile for households in the United States. And so you can see on the far right there is the top 1%. And then the graph on the right-hand side is showing you the difference between that median household wealth of the top 1% and the minimum starting requirement to be labeled a billionaire. And so you can see it's an enormous gap there. There are two goals to this paper. So the first is to introduce new data on the global economic elite, and to use that data to provide new estimates of wealth concentration at the very top, including of change over time. And the second is to go a step further and identify the sources of wealth among top wealth holders, and again, how they change over time. And so this will tell us something about not just how the wealth distribution is structured, but it will also say something about where to look for the mechanism of structuring it. So the data used in this paper, as I mentioned, is new data. And essentially what I've done is I've constructed a data set, a panel data set of 4,656 billionaires using the annual rich list published by Forbes along with other data sources. It's of all billionaires published in those lists between 1996 to 2022. And so there's 33,104 individual level observations. And so the individual observations are linked sort of longitudinally, the individuals, those 4,656. There's also some additional data collection from media reports, third-party interviews, the census, and other data sources. I'll talk a little bit more about that later if I have time. And then, of course, there's some country-level data I'm working with here too. Relevant fact here is that 84 countries have billionaires. So methods, very briefly, this paper is also comparative. Although the focus tends to naturally be on the countries that produce the most billionaires, the United States, China, and India, I consider wealth concentration both within and across countries. The wealth concentration figures themselves are used from the Forbes data that's linked longitudinally. Basically, I'm aggregating up the net worth figures. And then I'm expressing it as a proportion of national wealth shares using data from the World Inequality Database. For the second question about sort of the sources of wealth, what we do, and I say we because a team of research assistants helped me with kind of this monumental task here, is manually classify each of the billionaires according to this taxonomy, which was first developed by Freund and Oliver, two economists, first in a working paper and then in a short book, where they did this for, I think, 2 years. And then we've categorized each of these billionaires across this taxonomy, which you can see at the bottom of the slide here, twice. So you can imagine it took a very long time. So they were categorized first by one person and then second blindly by another person. And then there's a third tie-breaking round in the case of discrepancies. So I'll go over a few select findings.
What is a political capitalist?
Yeah, it's a great question. So essentially, this is a sort of two-tiered system. We have non-inherited and inherited, right? That's the first classification. They're inherited, there's no further subclassifications. But the non-inherited, I break down into 4 different groups. Political capitalists are people whose wealth is essentially created by their connections to individuals in government or through the privatization of state-owned enterprises or through the exploitation of natural resources, right? Anything in which we think that, political capital essentially played a role in the formation of the wealth, right? And we're using a counterfactual here. So the question is, would they have become a billionaire without those connections, without that connection to the state-owned enterprise, without that, lottery win at the, natural resource? And if the answer is no, then they don't fall into that category. Or sorry, then they do fall into that category. So a few select findings. So when we look at the wealth of billionaires, what do we see? Well, I don't think this is going to surprise anyone here, but billionaire wealth has grown significantly over the past quarter century. Between 1996 and 2022, it's grown by a factor of 7.9 from $1.6 trillion to $12.7 trillion. And the number of billionaires was increased by a factor of 6.8 from 397 to 2,709. And so because we have both this growth in the aggregate wealth and the number of billionaires, you might just assume that maybe there's an inflationary effect pushing them over this billion-dollar threshold, or there's something of that type. I address this in various ways in the paper, but the bottom line, which I think this graph captures, is that regardless of how you slice and dice the richest individuals in the world, this is sort of this consistent, substantial growth over time. So you can think about them as a fixed proportion of the population. You can think about them as a fixed number, the top 100, for example. You can think about them as just billionaires. You can think about them as billionaires if they were defined as billionaires in 1996, before you sort of play with inflation. Any which way you sort of slice it, you can see there's just sort of this tremendous growth in wealth. Here's another graph where I'm showing the growth in wealth concentration in the US specifically. And so the headline here is US billionaires have owned more wealth than the bottom 50% of American households since 2007. Now, I have to admit, I think there's a reason to say that this was true between 2007 and 2022. I suspect that it's not the case in 2023 because of some upward pressures at the bottom. I've yet to confirm that. I will soon, and that'll be in the paper, I'm sure. But that is still a fairly significant time period, 2007 to 2022, in which a few hundred households held more wealth than half of all Americans. And so this is US specific, but of course I have sort of other graphs of different countries, and I can talk about that in the paper. Before I just talk about this graph, let me just say that the US still produces the most billionaires, as it has since 1996, 135 in 1996, 736 in 2022. But a rising share has been produced in emerging market economies, including in China, which now has the second most, with 629 in 2022, India 175, Russia 85, Brazil 60. And so finally, I get to this question of the type of wealth. Where is it coming from? Is it largely old fortunes being recycled and grown through investment, inheritance, or is it new fortunes created in markets or through political capitalism? And so the answer is that less than half of all fortunes are now inherited, and that this is kind of a big change since 1996. The global proportion of inherited billionaires has declined almost continuously. In 1996, about 50.2% were heirs, and in 2022, only 29.2% were heirs. Conversely, the proportion who are entrepreneurs has risen from 32.5% in 1996 to 42.5% in 2022. Many of these billionaires who have not inherited their fortunes are in the computer and information technology sector, around 21%, but not as many. It's not sort of an overwhelming proportion, I think, as many sort of typically assume. There's a lot in manufacturing, there's a lot in healthcare, for instance. So billionaire wealth is now primarily non-inherited, but there is substantial variation between countries. In much of Western Europe, for example, in Northern Europe, there is substantially more inherited than non-inherited wealth. You can see here, here's a quick example of Germany, which has an overwhelming percentage of sort of inherited wealth. In the United States, it's predominantly non-inherited, and then in emerging markets, it's kind of mixed. China, for example, has the highest proportion of entrepreneurial wealth amongst these large producers. And in the former Soviet bloc countries, as you might imagine, there's a much higher degree of sort of political capitalism, which again is where the wealth is derived primarily from connections to the government or from the privatization of state-owned entities. So a few high-level conclusions, and then I'm done. One, billionaire wealth is growing rapidly, reflecting both greater wealth concentration and economic growth. You see this most clearly in some of those emerging economies like China, for example. China wasn't, it's sort of a recent rise when we think about the long history of countries. And as a result, it's produced a tremendous amount of wealth. Not so in the case of Western Europe, for example, where you still have very high proportions of inherited wealth. Number two, the creation of the new economic elite appears to be driven primarily by the growth in product markets and finance and not through inheritance. Although again, this is kind of case specific and it depends on which countries you're talking about. And then three, there is substantial variation in the sources of wealth across countries reflecting those institutional contexts, which I think I've just restated again, basically. But that's, worth sort of repeating. And so I think one of the next goals essentially has to be to explain, why wealth originates in different forms in these sort of different institutional contexts. And that's not the goal of this paper. This paper is purely descriptive, but maybe in future work I'll try to address that.
Junmo?
Yes.
Yes, the floor is yours.
Do you hear me? Yeah. I will share my presentation. Wait a minute. Do you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Let's start the presentation. Hello. I'm Junmo Song. I'm a PhD student from the Department of Sociology at Yonsei University in South Korea. Today, I will present on impact of categorization in the music market on product valuation. As you know, the categorization of product in the market is a central topic in economic sociology. The main approach to this topic, known as the categorical imperative, is the theory that products suffer a disadvantage in evaluation if their category is ambiguous. Imagine you are watching a new hypothetical Star Wars movie. And in this new movie, suppose there are robots acting like romantic comedy, and a spy of Leeds acting like 007, and a serial killer wielding a lightsaber like a chainsaw. Most people would likely be embarrassed. Watch the movie. However, method of categorization relying on traditional genre division exhibit limitations. Therefore, in this research, we propose a method of measuring substantive rather than formal category. The music market, where categories are of high importance but lacking in unity due to over fragmentation. Call for an alternative that captures substantive category. To this end, we collect and analyze approximately 18,000 reviews of about 30,000 albums from the online review aggregation site Metacritic.com. Our hypothesis proposed that high categorization variance negatively impacted valuation, and that the influence of substantive category measured by review is greater than that of formal category measured by genres. Our data source for this analysis is Metacritic.com. Metacritic compiles reviews from various sources, including mainstream media like New York Times or BBC, and specialized music outlets like Rolling Stones. To transform review written in English into numerical data, we use deep learning algorithm bot, along with famous GPT. But hold a state-of-the-art position in natural language processing algorithm. This algorithm resolves many issues with conventional topping model approach, allowing for more stable and robust result. These figures illustrate the process of measuring categorization variance. At first, let's look at the left panel. Using sentence path algorithm, each review can be transformed into coordinate in the vector space. The circular point represent individual review that have been transformed into representative vectors. These representative vectors are derived from the word composing the reviews represented by triangles. Now, let's move to the right panel. The right panel shows the same data and embedding result as the left panel. We calculate the cosine similarity between all possible pair between reviews within an album. The average value of the cosine similarity represents the categorization variance of an album. In this figure, the right panel shows that album B have a higher categorization variance than album A. This implies that the review of album A discuss a wider range of valuation criteria compared to the reviews for album A. This slide presents a mathematical formula used to calculate categorization variance illustrated in previous slide. This table lists variables used in this study. Score critic and score user are the dependent variables, while the rest are key independent and control variables. This graph displays trend in the music market over time. There exists only a very weak correlation between our new measurement categorization variance with the traditional measurement, the number of genres. This graph display demonstrates that categorization variance imply a diversity in evaluation criteria, not the valuation itself. If reviews are valuation itself, albums with low categorization variance should have very good or very low rating. But this graph shows not. This table presents our result of Tobin regression analysis. Tobin model was applied because the dependent variables are censored data. This is the scoring. So the dependent variables have a range from 0 to 100. These two graphs display the marginal effect of categorization variance from the model presented in the previous page. Low-level consensus about the category lower both critics and users' evaluation. Unlike the clear effect of categorization variance, the number of genres, a variable from traditional categorical approach, does not show a significant influence. In summary, unlike traditional categorical approach, genres does not influence valuation, while variation in consensus over categorization does not affect valuation. This suggests that the two measures capture different dimensions of categorization. And for the future development of our research, the following tests are necessary. Above all, we need to make clearer what the substantial category means. Throughout the techniques such as word clustering for semantic mapping, we should demonstrate the semantic dimension of category variance proposed in this study in an interpretable form. In addition, this study says critical evaluation as only dependent variable. But in the future, we need to analyze the relationship between commercial success and category variance by merging with external data, like the Billboard chart. Lastly, by controlling additional variables such as the scale of the album label and whether it's indie singer, we need to capture the pure causal effect of category variance for more accuracy. Yeah, our presentation over here. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you, Junmo. Okay, so we have to go to the next presentation because we have 15 minutes on the official schedule, but of course we will have time for discussion after that. So, Xanthe.
I'm just sharing my slides now. Can you see them okay? Okay, great.
Yes.
I'm going to try and skip through this quite quickly. I think it's a 20-minute presentation, so I'm going to try and turn it into a 10-minute presentation so that we have some time to discuss at the end. I'm talking today about the early childhood education and care, which often we refer to it as childcare. So it's care and education for children of preschool age. So in the UK, that means children up to about 4 or 5 years of age when they then start school. And what I want to talk about is the way that early childhood education and care is a market that is constructed by the state. And in particular, I'm interested in this paper in trying to theorize the relationship between the way that markets are created and the kinds of mechanisms that are used to marketize the sector, and how you can read through the effect on labor relations and labor conditions. So yeah, trying to think about the workforce and how it's affected by the particular model and mechanisms of marketization. One of the things to say about this area is that it's jumped up in the policy agenda in the UK recently, because the government made an announcement in its most recent budget that it would expand childcare. What that's meant for me is that I spend a lot of my time going off and talking to policy people, and as a result, I've raced here today to join you from another round table, and maybe my slides aren't going to keep up with where my ideas are. So I really welcome some discussion at the end, and I will try and skip through quite quickly. Just to give you a little bit of, so just something to say, I talk about early childhood education and care. It gets talked about colloquially as childcare or as the early years. We like to use this language of early childhood education and care to recognise that there is a strong educational element to this work, which is often ignored, I think, in the wider policy debates. And the sector or the provision of early childhood education and care contributes to quite a few different policy objectives, certainly in the UK, but I think this is more broadly general. There's an education element, so it's about getting children ready for school, developing some of their cognition and social skills and those sorts of things. It's often promoted very much in terms of labour market activation, so particularly about providing care in which enables parents and obviously most particularly mothers to enter the workforce. And then it also has objectives around social mobility. So the idea that children from more disadvantaged backgrounds having this earlier intervention will help to narrow some of the attainment gaps for young people. Something else that is particular to the system in the United Kingdom is that it's one of the most expensive early years provision in the world, and parents are often paying something equivalent to their mortgage in order to send their preschool children to nursery. So just to sort of put the delivery in context, quite often the system gets talked about as a mixed economy, and that's because the delivery the system is delivered through a range of private, voluntary, and state-funded providers. We would prefer, and that I think is the correct way to sort of describe the delivery of this service. Whereas we wanted to use our starting point about it as a sector which has been marketized in a particular way, and then to think about what the implications of that might be. What we've seen in the UK is the private market in early childhood education and care has expanded. So more and more of the places that are provided by for-profit providers. That was partly consolidated through legislation in 2006 through the Child Care Act, which basically meant that local authority or state provision would be the last resort. And so what we've seen over the last 15 years is a real consolidation of private delivery within the sector. Private for-profit companies delivering more and more of the overall number of places, but also we see more and more large chains entering in, some large chains which are owned by private equity. I won't talk about why private equity will be involved in childcare now, but and very much moving away and sort of, it's also seen the language change towards more of a sort of human capital approach, thinking about developing children and developing skills and those sorts of things, thought about in economic terms as an investment. I've talked about the consolidation and the corporatization. And there have, of course, all along the way been quite strong critiques about marketization, particularly focused on whether or not marketization can deliver quality of care and whether it can deliver equity of access. So then what we wanted to do was something a little bit different, which was to think about where does the workforce stand in all of this. Just to provide a bit of detail about the funding models and some of the decisions that have been made around marketization. So some of you might be familiar with Friedman's arguments around a voucher scheme for education. And this was an idea that he promoted really strongly. The idea that you give parents a voucher, an amount of money to spend on education, and they would go forward and make choices about where they would send their child. You get similar arguments in sort of lifelong education for adults, that you get a bundle of money and you go out and decide how to spend it. The idea about this being that you create demand by giving people the vouchers. In the case of early childhood education and care, the demand is about choice for parents. Quality sort of is supposed to come through that, because parents will make decisions about which is the quality way to spend their voucher. And you start to see competition between providers, the idea that this creates sort of innovation and cost efficiencies. The way that this is played out in the English system has ended up being the government subsidises or provides free entitlement care to parents for a certain amount of hours. So children from 2 years of age with parents of low income get 15 free hours. Working parents, and there are criteria around who gets care, and working parents get more care or they have to demonstrate that they're working at least 16 hours a week in order to access these vouchers. They get up to 30 free hours for children over 3 years of age. What's slightly different about this way of organising the vouchers is that it's not a situation where parents get the vouchers and they then go out and choose where they'll spend that money. The vouchers get given directly to the providers. And I think I'll talk a bit more about the detail of that in a minute. I think there are some other really important underlying trends about how and why marketisation works in the way that it does. Early childhood education and care is a tremendous, it's an incredibly feminized sector. I can see I haven't put some of the data in the bottom of this slide, but I'll try and explain that. So we had group-based, as it means like nurseries and school-based providers, tends to refer to publicly funded providers. They report that 97% of paid staff are women. You also have persistently low pay in the sector, so 1 in 8 being paid £5 an hour. That's actually below the minimum wage in the UK, and the reason why you have such low rates of pay is because you have young people and people working on apprenticeships who are being paid the national minimum wage. And I won't go through the details there, but you can really see average pay is really hovering not much above the national minimum wage, which is £8.91. That's for the whole average across the whole workforce. One of the things that we've seen, I think it happened around 2018, 2019, is that we saw pay in comparator sectors, so sectors like retail and hospitality, overtake pay in early childhood education and care. And as you might expect with this culmination of factors, you see a real recruitment and retention issues, which predate COVID, but were massively exacerbated by COVID. Gosh, I don't know how much time I've got left and I haven't got very far. So I want to...
5 minutes.
Just quickly to talk about so the data that this paper comes out of was based on a large-scale study that we carried out during COVID. I think that the important things to say are we had really big surveys, and we also interviewed all of these different groups across 2 waves. So we had sort of a wave of data in the midst of COVID, and then another wave of data to sort of see how the issues that were going on in COVID were persisting or not, sort of 6 to 12 months later. In particular, I'm going to focus in what I go through next on the responses from nursery managers who were talking about the decisions they were making to manage their nurseries, and on the other hand, nursery workers, or what we've entitled here childcare practitioners. So those people who are actually working under these conditions. And I think just to go through really quickly the way that we linked the sort of mechanisms of marketization to the kinds of work that and employment relations that we were seeing in early childhood education and care. I think the first thing was that demand-led funding leads to real financial volatility in settings. One thing that is common to all the settings is they operate on really low margins, so their financial viability will be completely dependent on whether they get 1 or 2 children enrolling. And if those 2 children don't enroll, that's it, they don't make ends meet. So it means that if there's any shift in demand, it can really place the setting under a huge amount of financial pressure. And one of the things that was interesting about doing the research during COVID is that we saw massive fluctuations in demand because parents were working from home. They weren't sending their children into childcare. They were worried about sending their children into childcare because they didn't want them exposed to COVID. And then you had parents who were leaving the workforce or who were furloughed, and so they weren't working and they didn't need the care. And so as a result of that changed demand, we saw huge indebtedness across the sector. And I think what we found really interesting was the responses that settings had to this. So many of them in the initial instance used reserves in order to try and balance out or survive their loss of income. Obviously, this is a very limited it's a time-limited response. There's only so long you can keep on using reserves, and not a long-term sustainable way for organisations to respond. So then the next raft of changes we saw were around staffing conditions, and you can see there 19.2% of the settings that we surveyed made changes to staff contract conditions. 14.3% permanently cut staff, 13.4% didn't renew temporary staff. What you don't see there as well is that a lot of the staff work on a part-time basis, and then they often supplement that part-time work with overtime hours, and a lot of that overtime hours were cut back, which if you're somebody who's working on a wage which is very close to the national minimum, means that loss of hours can result in a significant loss of income. So I think that's more or less, actually, that slide is what I was saying. So I guess the argument there in terms of linking marketisation and these particular mechanisms of marketisation is that volatility. I should also say staffing is something somewhere between 70 and 80% of costs for lots of settings, so that making those changes to staffing is really a lot of the only flexibility that these organisations had. One of the other things that we saw is this paradox arise where demand started to increase, but you have labour shortages in the sector, and there's no response by the nurseries to increase wages in order to increase to try and retain and recruit people. And I think there are a variety of ways in which the undervaluation of women's work occurs, but I think one of them is through this this sort of funding mechanism. I've run out of time, so I'm going to skip right through to my conclusions, or maybe just quickly talk about responsibilities. So another way that the state intervenes or tries to regulate the sector is through trying to regulate quality, and they do that principally in two ways. One is by having minimum qualification requirements, and so workers coming into the sector have to have particular national vocational qualifications to a certain level, and that's underpinned by ratios. So staff can look after a certain amount of children, and the higher their level of qualification, they can look after slightly more children. So that becoming qualified means that actually your work intensifies, because children don't get any less stressful to look after the more you know about looking after them. But also, because there is this qualification requirement, the qualifications aren't matched by funding which would see career progression align with pay progression. So it's another way in which there are education requirements, but they're literally not valued through the way that the funding operates. So just to sort of conclude, we think that it's important to sort of think about the early childhood education and care sector as a market which is constructed by the state. Oh gosh, I didn't say that the state is the most significant purchaser. So the state purchases 52% of places. It's just announced, the government's just announced an expansion, which will see it purchase somewhere between 70 and 80% of the places. And so as a kind of monopsony buyer, it acts as a price setter, which very much filters through to the wage levels of people working in the sector. I think, yeah, the demand-led provision has exposed it to a huge amount of volatility. So you get a lot of providers leaving the sector because they just can't make ends meet, or they're pushing that volatility down towards the people who are working in the sector. And then, yeah, I think I've said all the things on the conclusions if you've got any questions.